Hearken, O human spirit, and incline thine inner ear, for the path to enlightenment is not a roadway cast in the dust of earthly wanderings, nor a ladder constructed by the vanity of intellect, but a living ascent of the soul that unfolds only to those who, in humility and earnest striving, submit themselves willingly to the immutable laws that streams forth from the eternal source. For enlightenment is neither granted as a gift to the idle, nor seized as a trophy by the ambitious, but is born within the one who has purified his will into harmony with the divine order, whose inner perception has become keen enough to recognize truth, not as a concept, but as living reality, permeating all that exists, so that he no longer seeks outside himself what must first awaken within his own spiritual core. Man errs gravely when he imagines enlightenment to be an attainment of knowledge, an accumulation of esoteric facts, or an exalted state of consciousness achieved through techniques and exercises, for such pursuits remain bound to the realm of intellect, which, though a necessary instrument, is incapable of perceiving the supra-material truth, since the intellect is born of the brain, and thus belongs to the transient, whereas enlightenment arises from the spirit, and therefore belongs to the eternal. And only when man learns to place the intellect into rightful service beneath the guidance of intuitive spiritual perception does the veil begin to thin that separates him from the luminous reality of creation. The path to enlightenment begins with self-recognition, not as flattering acknowledgement of imagined virtues, but as a sober and unrelenting confrontation with one's true inner condition. For every unclean thought, every ignoble desire, every concealed resentment forms a weight that drags the soul downward and dulls its perception, while every pure striving, every noble intention, every sincere act of goodness lightens the soul and refines its receptivity, so that enlightenment is not a sudden leap from darkness into light, but a gradual clarifying of inner sight through the continuous purification of one's volition. It must be understood that the laws of creation operate with absolute precision and unerring justice, granting to each soul only that which it has inwardly prepared itself to receive, so that no prayer, no mantra, no ritual can substitute for the inner work of self-transformation. For the divine does not respond to outer gestures, but to the silent language of the soul, and this language speaks more clearly through the quality of one's will, which weaves ceaselessly the threads of destiny and determines whether a human being ascends towards light or sinks further into density. Thus, the inner seeker must first learn reverence, not as a hollow posture of submission, but as a living attitude of awe toward the sublime perfection of creation. For reverence softens the hardened heart, dissolves arrogance, and opens the inner gateways through which higher perception can flow, whereas irreverence, mockery, and careless familiarity with sacred matters erects thick walls that no teaching can penetrate. And it is precisely this reverence that forms the foundation upon which all higher development must rest. Closely bound to reverence is humility, not the false humility that masks inner pride, but the clear recognition of one's smallness before the greatness of the eternal. For only the humble can learn, and only the learner can grow, while the one who imagines himself already enlightened has in truth sealed his own spiritual coffin. For self-satisfaction is the most subtle and most deadly poison of the soul, lulling it into a stage of stagnation while it dreams of progress. The path to enlightenment demands unwavering honesty toward oneself, for self-deception clouds perception more effectively than any outer darkness, and the human being who excuses his weaknesses, justifies his failings, and shifts blame onto others builds a labyrinth in which he himself becomes lost. Whereas the one who courageously acknowledges his shortcomings gains power over them, and in this gaining of power lies the first true step toward liberation. Man must also grasp that enlightenment cannot be separated from ethical living, for there exists no spiritual height that can be reached by trampling upon moral law. Since the laws of creation are not divided into spiritual and earthly compartments, but form a single, seamless order, so that every violation of conscience, every act of injustice, every deliberate harm inflicted upon another being generates a dissonance that reverberates through the soul and obscures its light, making genuine enlightenment impossible. Therefore, purity of thought stands as a central pillar upon the path. For thoughts are living forms that shape both the inner world and the outer destiny, and the human being who tolerates impure fantasies, destructive imaginings, or malicious intentions poisons his own spiritual atmosphere, while the one who vigilantly guards his thought world creates within himself a liminal sphere in which higher inspirations can descend and take root. Yet, purity must not be misunderstood as repression, for repression merely drives impurities into hidden chambers where they fester and grow stronger, whereas true purity arises from insight, from the recognition that lower impulses bring suffering, while noble striving brings peace, so that the soul voluntarily turns away from what degrades it and gravitates toward what elevates it. Not through fear, but through understanding. Another indispensable aspect of the path is responsibility, for enlightenment is inseparable from the willingness to bear the consequences of one's choices without complaint, and the human being who blames fate, society, or other people for his circumstances reveals that he has not yet grasped the law of reciprocal action, which returns to each soul the exact measure of what it has sent forth. And only when man accepts this law as just and beneficent does he begin to stand firmly upon his own spiritual feet. The seeker must also cultivate stillness, for the higher worlds do not shout, and truth does not compete with the noise of the restless thought, but speaks softly to the receptive soul in moments of inward silence. And this silence is not mere absence of sound, but a collected attentiveness in which the turbulent waves of emotion and intellect are calmed, allowing the deeper currents of intuitive perception to surface. However, stillness alone is insufficient without earnest striving, for passive waiting breeds illusion, and the soul that expects enlightenment to descend upon it without effort resembles a farmer who waits for harvest without sowing seed, while true striving expresses itself through daily conscious efforts to live more purely, more justly, more lovingly, and more truthfully, regardless of whether such efforts are acknowledged by others. The path to enlightenment also demands endurance, for there will be phases of apparent stagnation, moments when progress seems invisible, and periods when old weaknesses reemerge with renewed force. Yet, these experiences are not signs of failure, but tests of perseverance, designed to strengthen the soul's resolve and to purify its motives so that it seeks light not for exaltation, but for truth itself. It must be emphasized that enlightenment does not remove man from earthly life, nor does it render him indifferent to human concerns, but rather deepens his sense of responsibility toward the world. For the more clearly one perceives the interconnectedness of all things, the more keenly one feels the weight of every thought, word, and deed, and more carefully one shapes one's conduct. The enlightened human being is not characterized by dramatic displays of power or mysterious abilities, but by simplicity, naturalness, and inner steadiness, for his strength flows not from domination, but from harmony with the divine will, and his presence radiates peace, not because he strives to appear peaceful, but because peace has become the natural state of his being. One of the gravest misconceptions is the belief that enlightenment elevates a person above others, whereas in truth it binds him more deeply to them through compassionate understanding. For he recognizes that every soul is on its own stage of development, and that harsh judgment only reveals ignorance of the long journey every spirit must traverse. Thus, the path to enlightenment is at once solitary and communal. Solitary in that each soul must walk it by its own striving, and communal in that every act of goodness contributes to the elevation of the whole, and the very act of baseness weighs upon the collective, so that no one evolves in isolation and no one falls alone. Ultimately, enlightenment is the gradual awakening of the human spirit to its true origin and destiny, the remembrance that it did not arise from dust, and it will not dissolve into nothingness, but issued from the light, and is called to return consciously to that light through volitional alignment with divine law. And this return is not a movement through space, but a transformation of inner state. When this awakening deepens, the soul no longer seeks enlightenment as a goal, for it has become a way of being, a continuous unfolding in which every day offers new opportunities for refinement. Every encounter becomes a lesson, and every experience, whether pleasant or painful, is recognized as a messenger bearing instruction. Thus, the path to enlightenment is not a path that ends, but a path that eternally widens, living ever deeper into inexhaustible richness of truth. And blessed is the human being who, in humility and perseverance, sets his foot upon this path and refuses to turn back. For though the way is narrow and demanding, it alone leads to genuine freedom, enduring peace, and conscious union with the eternal source.